May 31, 1992, the Washington Post publishes an article with the headline, "A Not-So-Safe House. At the Greenbrier, the elite meet in secret to rehearse for doomsday." Within hours, one of the U.S. government's most closely guarded Cold War secrets is exposed to the world. For 30 years, beneath one of America's most exclusive luxury resorts, the Greenbrier in West Virginia, there had been a massive underground bunker designed to house the entire United States Congress in the event of nuclear war. 112,000 square feet of reinforced concrete buried under a mountain, dormitories for 1,100 people, a hospital, a power plant, decontamination chambers. Enough supplies to sustain the legislative branch of government for 60 days while the world burned above them. The bunker was never used, not once. For 3 decades, it sat empty, maintained by a secret team posing as hotel employees, waiting for an apocalypse that never came. But here's what makes the story truly dark. The Greenbrier staff, bellhops, maintenance workers, landscapers, many of them knew. They lived double lives, maintaining the illusion of a luxury resort while secretly serving as caretakers for a government tomb. They spent their careers preparing for the day when their workplace would become a shelter for the most powerful politicians in America, while their own families burned in nuclear fire outside. They were told this was patriotic duty. They were told secrecy was essential to national security. They were told they were protecting democracy. What they were really protecting was a lie, the idea that government could survive nuclear war, that there was a plan, that someone would be saved. This is the story of the Greenbrier, a 250-year-old resort in the mountains of West Virginia that became a monument to Cold War paranoia, governmental deception, and the fantasy that you can prepare for the apocalypse by building a bigger basement. It's the story of America's nuclear fortress, and the ordinary people who spent their lives maintaining a tomb that was never supposed to be opened. To understand the Greenbrier bunker, you first have to understand the Greenbrier itself. The Greenbrier sits in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, in the Allegheny Mountains. The area has been attracting wealthy visitors since the 1770s, when people believed the natural sulfur springs had healing properties. By the 1800s, a resort had been built, a collection of cottages and bathhouses where Southern aristocracy would spend summers taking the waters. The resort burned down and was rebuilt multiple times. But by the early 1900s, the Greenbrier had established itself as one of America's premier luxury destinations. Presidents stayed there. Industrialists held business meetings there. It was a place where the American elite could retreat from the world. Then World War II arrived, and the U.S. government took over the resort. In 1942, the Greenbrier was converted into a hospital for wounded soldiers, Ashford General Hospital. The grand ballrooms became operating rooms. The luxury suites became recovery wards. For 3 years, the resort that had hosted debutante balls and presidential dinners became a place where young men died from their wounds. After the war, the hotel was returned to private ownership. It was renovated, expanded, and reopened in 1948. The Greenbrier was once again a luxury resort. But the experience of being seized by the federal government had taught the hotel's owners something important. The government could take their property whenever it wanted. So when the government came calling again in 1958 with a strange proposal, the hotel's management was receptive. The proposal was this: the U.S. government wanted to build a massive underground bunker beneath the Greenbrier. The bunker would serve as a relocation facility for Congress in the event of nuclear war. It would be built in complete secrecy, disguised as a new conference center and exhibition hall. The hotel would continue operating normally above ground. But below, hidden from guests, staff, and the public, would be a facility capable of housing the entire legislative branch of the federal government. In exchange, the government would pay for the construction, officially described as improvements to the resort's conference facilities, and would provide the hotel with a state-of-the-art conference center that could be used for regular business when there wasn't a nuclear war happening. The hotel's owners agreed. Construction began in 1959. For 3 years, workers excavated into the mountainside adjacent to the hotel. They poured 50,000 cubic yards of concrete, enough to build a 16-foot-wide sidewalk from New York to Los Angeles. They installed blast doors weighing 25 tons each. They built an underground power plant, water purification systems, air filtration systems capable of removing radioactive fallout. Above ground, the cover story was simple. The Greenbrier was building a new West Virginia wing to expand its conference facilities. The construction was visible, loud, and completely mundane. Guests complained about the noise. Local newspapers covered it as a business story. No one suspected what was really being built. The bunker was completed in 1962. It was codenamed Project Greek Island. The public facility, the part guests could see, was a 90,000 square foot exhibition hall with meeting rooms, ballrooms, and hotel suites. It looked expensive and elegant, exactly what you'd expect from the Greenbrier. But behind unmarked doors, down corridors labeled mechanical equipment, was the real facility. A bunker designed to keep 1,100 members of Congress alive for 60 days, while civilization collapsed above them. The bunker was divided into sections, the dormitories, bunk beds arranged in tight rows, no privacy. Members of Congress would sleep in the same conditions as military barracks. Senators and representatives sharing space with their aides, all equally uncomfortable. The Senate chamber, a large room with rows of desks and a podium. In the event of nuclear war, the Senate would continue to meet, presumably to debate legislation for a country that no longer existed. The House chamber, same concept, bigger room. Democracy would continue even if there was no one left to govern. The hospital, equipped for surgery with beds for 50 patients, stocked with medical supplies, antibiotics, morphine. No explanation for what would happen after 60 days when supplies ran out. The power plant, 3 massive diesel generators capable of running indefinitely as long as fuel lasted. Fuel storage for several weeks. Decontamination chambers, where people entering from the contaminated outside would be stripped, scrubbed, and checked for radiation exposure. The process was designed to prevent fallout from entering the bunker. It would be uncomfortable, humiliating, and possibly futile. The kitchen and cafeteria, industrial-scale food preparation equipment, freezers and storage rooms stocked with enough food for 1,100 people for 60 days. The menu would not be luxurious. The communication center, radio equipment, teletype machines, and eventually computer systems to maintain contact with other government relocation facilities, assuming any survived. The water system, underground wells and purification systems. The bunker had its own completely independent water supply. Everything was designed to be self-sufficient. The bunker could seal itself off completely from the outside world and sustain 1,100 people for 2 months. But here's the critical detail. There was no plan for what would happen after 60 days. No long-term food storage, no agricultural capability, no sustainable water recycling beyond basic purification. The bunker was designed to keep Congress alive for 2 months, after which they would presumably emerge into whatever remained of America. The unspoken assumption was that 2 months would be enough for the worst of the fallout to dissipate, that there would still be a country to govern, that resuming normal government operations would be possible, This assumption was, at best, wildly optimistic. At worst, it was a fantasy that allowed politicians to believe they could survive nuclear war. Project Greek Island required a permanent maintenance staff. The bunker couldn't just sit empty. It needed to be tested, serviced, and kept operational. Equipment had to run periodically. Supplies had to be rotated. Systems had to be inspected. But the staff couldn't be military or government officials. That would attract attention. They needed to be invisible. They needed to blend in with the resort's normal operations. So the government created a cover company, Forsyth Associates. Forsyth Associates was officially a firm that maintained the Greenbrier's audiovisual equipment. They had an office in the West Virginia wing near the conference rooms. They wore civilian clothes. They worked regular hours. To hotel guests and most staff, they were just the AV guys, the people you called when the microphone wasn't working in the ballroom. In reality, Forsyth Associates employees were government contractors, many of them former military, whose job was to maintain the bunker. They had security clearances. They signed non-disclosure agreements that threatened federal prosecution if they revealed what they were really doing. And they lived in White Sulphur Springs, a small town of about 2,500 people, where everyone knew everyone and secrets were nearly impossible to keep. The Forsyth team ranged from about a dozen to 20 people, depending on the era. They would arrive at the Greenbrier each morning like normal employees. They'd spend their days in the bunker testing generators, checking air filtration systems, inspecting food supplies, running drills. Then they'd go home to their families and couldn't talk about what they'd done all day. Some of their families knew. It was impossible to completely hide. A wife would notice that her husband's AV equipment maintenance job required a top-secret security clearance. Children would ask why Dad couldn't talk about work. But officially, the families knew nothing. The psychological toll was significant. These were ordinary people, technicians, engineers, maintenance workers, who'd been entrusted with an extraordinary secret. They couldn't discuss their work with friends. They couldn't explain the stress or the ethical weight of what they were doing. They just had to maintain the bunker and pretend their jobs were mundane. And they had to live with the knowledge that in the event of nuclear war, they would not be allowed in the bunker. This was explicit in their contracts. Forsyth Associates employees were responsible for maintaining the facility, but they were not on the list of people who would be evacuated there. That list was exclusively members of Congress and essential staff. The maintenance workers who spent decades keeping the bunker operational would be left outside when the doors sealed. Think about that for a moment. You spend 30 years of your life maintaining a bomb shelter. You know every corridor, every system, every emergency protocol. You've dedicated your career to ensuring this facility will save lives in a nuclear war. And when that war comes, you're not allowed inside. Your family burns. You burn. The politicians you've been serving get to survive. How do you live with that? Some Forsyth employees rationalized it as patriotic duty. They were protecting democracy, ensuring the continuity of government, serving a higher purpose. Others became cynical, viewing it as just a job with good benefits and job security. A few quit, unable to handle the moral weight, but most stayed. They stayed because they'd signed contracts, because they needed the paycheck, because they'd built lives in White Sulphur Springs and couldn't easily leave. And they maintained the tomb. Year after year, waiting for an apocalypse that would kill them but save the people they served. Meanwhile, above ground, the Greenbrier continued operating as one of America's most exclusive resorts. Guests had no idea. They'd attend conferences in the West Virginia wing, walk past the unmarked doors that led to the bunker, and never suspect what was behind them. They'd see Forsyth Associates employees setting up microphones for presentations, and assume they were just hotel staff. The secrecy was maintained through careful compartmentalization. Most Greenbrier employees knew nothing about the bunker. The hotel's management knew. They had to, since they were cooperating with the government. But bellhops, housekeepers, restaurant staff, most of them were kept completely in the dark. However, some staff figured it out. It was inevitable. Maintenance workers would notice that certain areas of the West Virginia wing used extraordinary amounts of power. Electricians would see circuit breakers, labeled for equipment that didn't make sense for a conference center. Landscapers would notice air intake vents camouflaged in the hillside, far more ventilation than a normal building would need. And people talked. In a small town like White Sulphur Springs, everyone knew someone who worked at the Greenbrier. Information leaked, not as official disclosure but as rumor and speculation. By the 1980s, many locals had some version of the truth. There was something secret under the hotel, probably related to the government, possibly a bunker of some kind. But no one knew the full scope. And no one talked about it publicly because the economic survival of White Sulphur Springs depended on the Greenbrier. You didn't jeopardize the town's biggest employer by spreading rumors. This created a strange dynamic, an open secret that everyone knew but no one acknowledged. The Greenbrier benefited enormously from the arrangement. The government paid for construction and maintenance of the conference facilities. Government contracts brought business to the resort. Congressional delegations would hold retreats at the Greenbrier, ostensibly for the conference rooms, but really so members of Congress could familiarize themselves with the facility they might need to evacuate to. These congressional visits had a surreal quality. Politicians would tour the public areas of the West Virginia wing, hold meetings, give speeches. Some of them knew about the bunker and had been briefed on the evacuation plan. Others didn't know and were just attending a normal congressional retreat. During these visits, Forsyth associates would be in the bunker below, making sure everything was operational in case the alert came. The members of Congress walking above them might soon be sleeping in the bunks below them. If the world ended, it was theater. An elaborate performance where everyone played their role. The resort staff maintaining luxury, the government contractors maintaining the bunker, the politicians maintaining plausible deniability. And underlying all of it was the central fiction, that this plan made sense, that in the event of a nuclear war that killed millions of Americans, the priority should be saving Congress. That democracy could continue in a bunker while the country it governed was destroyed. Before we get into what happened when the secret was finally exposed, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this story as fascinating and disturbing as I do, this intersection of Cold War paranoia, government secrecy, and ordinary people maintaining a doomsday facility, please hit that subscribe button. We research these stories thoroughly and bring them to you every week, and I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country in the comments below. Is this American Cold War story resonating with you in Germany, Australia, Brazil, Japan? Let me know. Now let's talk about how the secret finally came out. The secret of Project Greek Island was finally exposed on May 31, 1992, when Washington Post reporter Ted Gupp published his investigation. Gupp had been investigating the story for months. He'd interviewed former Forsyth Associates employees, people who'd left the program and were willing to talk. He'd obtained declassified documents. He'd pieced together the full scope of the bunker from multiple sources. When the Post contacted the Greenbrier for comment before publication, the hotel's management panicked. They called the government. The government confirmed, yes, the bunker exists. Yes, it's been secret for 3 decades. And yes, now that it's about to be exposed, it's useless. The entire premise of the bunker depended on secrecy. If the Soviets, or anyone else with nuclear weapons, knew where Congress would relocate during a war, they could simply target that location. The bunker had to be unknown to be effective. Once Gupp's article was published, Project Greek Island was compromised. Within days, the government decommissioned the facility. Forsyth Associates was disbanded. The bunker was no longer a secret government installation. It was just an expensive basement that would never be used. The Greenbrier's management made a business decision, turned the bunker into a tourist attraction. Starting in 1995, the hotel began offering tour of the bunker. For $30, guests could walk through the facility that had been hidden for 30 years. They could see the dormitories, the Senate chamber, the decontamination rooms, the power plant, all of it preserved exactly as it had been when the government abandoned it. The tour were hugely popular. The bunker became the Greenbrier's most famous feature. What had been the hotel's deepest secret became its biggest marketing asset. But the tour raised uncomfortable questions that guides had difficulty answering. Who decided that members of Congress deserved to survive while everyone else died? How much did this cost? Couldn't that money have been spent on actual civil defense for ordinary citizens? Did anyone really believe government could function from a bunker while the country was destroyed? What were they? Forsyth Associates employees supposed to do when the doors sealed and they were left outside? The guides would give carefully rehearsed answers about the importance of continuity of government, the need for leadership during crisis, the practical limitations of who could be saved. But the questions persisted because they revealed the core contradiction of the entire project. The bunker was built on the premise that some lives matter more than others, that preserving the institution of Congress was more important than protecting the people Congress represented, that 1,100 politicians and their staff deserved survival, while 300 million Americans did not. This wasn't unique to Project Greek Island. The entire Cold War civil defense strategy operated on this principle. There were bunkers for the president, multiple facilities, including Mount Weather and Raven Rock. Bunkers for military leadership, bunkers for executive branch officials, but there was nothing comparable for ordinary citizens. The government's advice for surviving nuclear war was duck and cover, crawl under your desk and hope for the best. No bunkers, no evacuation plans, no supplies. The message was clear. If nuclear war happens, you're on your own. But don't worry, your government will survive to govern whatever's left. The Forsyth Associates employees had mixed reactions to the exposure. Some felt relief. They'd carried this secret for decades, unable to share it with family or friends. Now they could finally talk about what they'd really been doing. The weight of secrecy was lifted. Others felt betrayed. They'd been promised that their work was essential to national security. They'd been told that maintaining the bunker was patriotic duty. Now it turned out the government was willing to expose and abandon the facility the moment it became inconvenient. 30 years of work rendered meaningless by a single newspaper article. A few felt vindicated. They'd always suspected the bunker was absurd, a Cold War fantasy that would never actually function as designed. The exposure proved them right. But all of them had to confront the reality. They'd spent significant portions of their lives maintaining a facility that was never used and never would be. The apocalypse they'd prepared for never came, and when the secret was revealed, the government didn't thank them for their service or acknowledge their sacrifice. They were just quietly let go. Some former Forsyth employees were hired by the Greenbrier to work as bunker tour guides, which meant they spent their retirement explaining to tourists the facility they'd maintained in secret for decades. Imagine spending 30 years unable to tell anyone about your job, and then spending your retirement telling the story over and over to strangers. The psychological complexity of that role is staggering. You're commodifying your own secret history. You're turning your patriotic duty into entertainment. You're explaining to tourists how you prepared for nuclear war while privately wondering if any of it mattered. One former Forsyth employee, interviewed years after the exposure, said, "We knew we weren't getting in. We knew our families weren't getting in. But we believed it was important that someone survived. That government survived." Whether that was naive or patriotic, I still don't know. That ambivalence, that inability to decide whether their work was meaningful or absurd, seems to be common among the Forsyth employees. They can't fully embrace the patriotic narrative because they know how cynical the plan was. But they can't fully reject it either because they devoted their careers to it. They exist in a strange liminal space, neither heroes nor dupes, neither victims nor collaborators. They were ordinary people who agreed to maintain a tomb for the powerful, and they're still figuring out what that means. The bunker tour continued until 2018, when the Greenbrier closed the facility to the public again, this time not for secrecy, but for security concerns and maintenance costs. The bunker still exists. It's still underneath the resort, but it's no longer operational and no longer open to visitors. The Greenbrier's management decided that maintaining the facility as a tourist attraction was too expensive and potentially problematic given current security concerns. So now the bunker sits empty again, just like it did for 30 years during the Cold War, except now it's genuinely abandoned, no maintenance staff, no government contracts, no purpose at all. It's a tomb that was never used, then briefly became a museum, and is now just a massive basement full of outdated equipment and Cold War relics. But the larger questions the bunker represents haven't gone away. Project Greek Island was decommissioned in 1992, but the government still maintains bunkers for leadership continuity. Mount Weather in Virginia, Raven Rock in Pennsylvania, Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, multiple facilities whose exact locations and capabilities are classified. These facilities operate on the same premise as the Greenbrier bunker. In the event of catastrophic attack, government leadership must survive to maintain continuity. The powerful get bunkers. Everyone else gets wishes and prayers, and this premise is rarely interrogated. We accept, almost without question, that preserving government institutions is more important than protecting citizens. That leadership continuity matters more than population survival. But why? In the event of nuclear war catastrophic enough to require evacuating Congress to a bunker, what exactly would Congress do? Who would they govern? What laws would they pass for a country that no longer existed? The bunker at the Greenbrier could sustain 1,100 people for 60 days. After that, they'd emerge into a radioactive wasteland with no food production, no infrastructure, no communication networks, no functioning economy. And they'd do what exactly? Resume legislative sessions, debate bills, maintain parliamentary procedure while millions of their constituents were dead or dying. The entire concept collapses under scrutiny. But it persisted for 30 years because it allowed powerful people to believe they could survive the unsurvivable, that there was a plan, that someone was in control. Project Greek Island was theater, an elaborate, expensive performance designed to create the illusion of preparedness. The bunker would never have functioned as designed because the scenario it was designed for, limited nuclear war followed by rapid recovery, was a fantasy. But admitting that would mean admitting that nuclear war has no good outcome, that there's no scenario where building bunkers for politicians makes sense, that the entire Cold War civil defense strategy was based on denial and delusion. So instead, we built the bunkers, we maintained them, we told ourselves they mattered. And people like the Forsyth Associates employees spent their lives servicing that delusion. I want to pause here because we're We're about to get into the philosophical implications of all this, and I want to make sure you're still with me. If you're finding this analysis valuable, if you appreciate the research and the critical examination of Cold War civil defense policy, please subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making these in-depth documentaries. And one more time, what country are you watching from? I'm fascinated to know if this American Cold War story resonates differently depending on where you are in the world. Drop it in the comments. Now let's talk about what the Greenbrier bunker tells us about power, survival, and who gets saved. There's a moral philosophy problem called the lifeboat dilemma. Here's the basic version. A ship is sinking. There's one lifeboat. It can hold 10 people. There are 50 people on the ship. Who gets in the lifeboat? The usual answers are the women and children, the people closest to the lifeboat, the people who can row, the people chosen by lottery, the people who can fight their way aboard. The Greenbrier bunker was a lifeboat problem on a national scale. In the event of nuclear war, there's limited shelter. Who gets saved? The government's answer was, the government gets saved. Not scientists who could help rebuild, not engineers who could restore infrastructure, not doctors who could treat the wounded, not farmers who could restart food production. Politicians. Legislative branch politicians specifically. People whose primary skill is winning elections and debating legislation. This choice reveals something fundamental about how power operates. The people with power design survival systems to preserve their own power. The bunker wasn't built to maximize human survival or civilizational recovery. It was built to ensure that the existing power structure would persist even after the society it governed was destroyed. And this is dressed up as patriotism, as continuity of government, as preserving democracy. But what democracy exists when the people you govern are dead? The Greenbrier bunker was designed to house Congress, not state governors who might actually have local authority to coordinate rescue and recovery. Not mayors who know their communities and could organize survival efforts. Federal legislators, people whose actual utility in a post-apocalyptic scenario would be approximately zero. But they're the ones who authorized the budget for the bunker. They're the ones who decided who deserved to be saved. And unsurprisingly, they decided that they deserved to be saved. This is the dark heart of Project Greek Island. It wasn't a survival plan. It was a power preservation plan. It was designed to ensure that even if America was destroyed, the people who'd been in charge of America would still be in charge of whatever remained. The Forsyth Associates employees maintained this system. They enabled it. They kept the machinery of power preservation running for 30 years. Were they complicit? Or were they just doing their jobs? The answer is both, and that's what makes it complicated. They didn't design the system. They didn't decide that Congress deserved bunkers while ordinary citizens got duck-and-cover drills. They just maintained the equipment. They followed orders. They served their country as they understood service, but their service enabled a system that was fundamentally unjust, and they knew it. They knew they weren't getting in the bunker. They knew their families weren't getting in. They knew that the survival plan they were maintaining didn't include them, and they did it anyway. Some did it for money. Some did it out of patriotism. Some did it because they'd signed contracts and built careers and couldn't easily walk away. But the result was the same. They spent their lives maintaining a system designed to save people who'd done nothing to earn survival except hold political office. The Greenbrier today operates much as it did during the Cold War, as a luxury resort for the wealthy and powerful. Rooms cost $400, $800 per night. The resort hosts corporate retreats, golf tournaments, and political conferences. It's still a place where elites gather, still a symbol of wealth and exclusivity. The bunker is closed to tourists but hasn't been demolished. It's still there, buried under the West Virginia wing, a monument to Cold War paranoia and governmental hubris. Occasionally, the media rediscovers the story. A documentary will be made. A journalist will write a retrospective. The Greenbrier will get inquiries about reopening the bunker tour. But the questions remain unanswered. Was the bunker ever a serious plan, or was it always theater? Did the government genuinely believe Congress could govern from a bunker, or was the bunker just a way to make politicians feel safer? How much did Project Greek Island cost? The exact figure is classified, but estimates range from $50 million to over $100 million in 1962 dollars. That's roughly $500 million to $1 billion in today's money. For a facility that was never used and never would have worked as designed, could that money have been spent on actual civil defense, on public shelters, on evacuation planning for cities, on medical stockpiles? Of course it could have, but that would have required admitting that in a nuclear war everyone is at risk, including politicians. That survival isn't something you can guarantee by building a bigger bunker, that the only winning move is not to play. Instead, we built the bunker. We maintained the illusion of preparedness. We told ourselves that leadership continuity mattered more than human survival. And when the illusion collapsed, when the bunker was exposed and decommissioned, we turned it into a tourist attraction. We commodified our own delusion. The Greenbrier bunker is now a historical curiosity, a Cold War relic, a quirky feature of a luxury resort, but it should be more than that. It should be a reminder of what happens when power designs its own survival systems. When the people who make decisions about who lives and who dies are the same people who ensure they're in the lives category. It should be a monument to the ordinary people who maintain the machinery of that injustice. The Forsyth Associates employees who spent their careers knowing they were excluded from the salvation. They were preparing. It should be evidence that we never seriously grappled with the moral implications of nuclear weapons. That we built bunkers for politicians instead of acknowledging that nuclear war has no winners, no survivors, no acceptable outcome. But instead, it's a basement full of old equipment that the Greenbrier doesn't want to pay to maintain. There's one final story about the bunker that deserves to be told. In 1998, during the brief period when the bunker was open for tour, a former Forsyth Associates employee was working as a tour guide. He was in his 70s by then, had maintained the bunker for over 20 years during the Cold War. A tourist asked him, "Did you ever think this was absurd? Did you ever question whether any of this made sense?" The guide paused. Then he said, "Every single day, but I had a family to feed, and I signed a contract that said I couldn't talk about my doubts. So I kept them to myself. I went to work. I maintained the generators, checked the air filters, rotated the food supplies. And I tried not to think about what it meant." "Did it mean anything?" the tourist asked. The guide looked around the bunker, the dormitories, the Senate chamber, the decontamination rooms. 30 years of his life spent maintaining this facility, decades of secrecy, all for a plan that never activated and never would have worked. "I honestly don't know," he said. "I spent half my life down here. And I still don't know if any of it mattered." That ambivalence, that profound uncertainty about whether his work had meaning, seems like the most honest response to Project Greek Island. The bunker was simultaneously essential and absurd. It was a necessary component of Cold War deterrent strategy and a monument to governmental delusion. It represented America's commitment to continuity of government and America's willingness to sacrifice its own people to preserve power structures. It was all of these things at once. And the people who maintained it had to live with that contradiction. The Forsyth Associates employees weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were ordinary people caught in an extraordinary situation, maintaining a system they didn't design and couldn't control, serving a purpose they couldn't fully believe in. And when the system was finally exposed and abandoned, they were left with the question, what was it all for? The government said it was for national security, for preserving democracy, for ensuring that leadership would survive to rebuild America after nuclear war. But the Forsyth employees knew better. They knew they weren't getting in. They knew the plan was flawed. They knew that 60 days of supplies wouldn't matter if the world outside was uninhabitable. They knew the bunker was theater, but they maintained it anyway, because that's what ordinary people do. They follow orders, they do their jobs, they maintain the systems they're told to maintain even when those systems are absurd, and then they live with the consequences. The Greenbrier still stands. The resort still operates. Guests still arrive to play golf, attend conferences, and enjoy luxury accommodations. Beneath them the bunker sits empty, dark, silent, waiting for nothing. The generators haven't run in years. The air filtration systems are dormant. The dormitories are gathering dust. The Senate chamber where democracy would have continued during the apocalypse is just a room full of desks that will never be used. Project Greek Island is over. The Cold War is over. The threat of nuclear annihilation that justified the bunker still exists. In fact, it's arguably worse now, with more nations possessing nuclear weapons. But we no longer pretend that bunkers are the answer. We no longer maintain the illusion that there's a plan, that someone will be saved, that government can survive the unsurvivable, or maybe we do. Maybe there are new bunkers, more sophisticated ones, better hidden. Maybe the powerful still believe they can escape the consequences of nuclear war through better architecture. I don't know. Those facilities are classified. But I know this. The Greenbrier bunker was never about saving democracy. It was about saving powerful people. About creating a lifeboat for politicians while everyone else drowned. And ordinary people, maintenance workers, technicians, engineers, spent their careers maintaining that lifeboat. They did it for paychecks, for patriotism, for reasons they probably didn't fully understand. They did it even though they knew they'd never be allowed aboard. That's the dark story of the Greenbrier. Not the bunker itself, though that's dark enough, but the fact that ordinary people dedicated their lives to maintaining a system designed to exclude them. The fact that we built monuments to the survival of power instead of the survival of people. The fact that when the apocalypse came, the plan was never to save everyone. It was to save the few who decided they mattered most. The Greenbrier bunker is a tomb that was never used, but in a way, that makes it more disturbing. Because it means we built it knowing we'd probably never need it. We maintained it for 30 years as a symbol, a performance of preparedness, a theater of survival, a monument to the delusion that nuclear war was survivable if you had the right connections. The people who maintained that delusion, the Forsyth Associates employees, are mostly gone now, retired, relocated, or dead. Their work is forgotten except when someone takes a tour and hears about the secret bunker under the resort. But their story matters, because it's a story about what power demands from ordinary people, about the compromises we make to keep our jobs, feed our families, and serve what we're told is a greater good. It's a story about how easy it is to maintain a system you don't believe in, as long as you can compartmentalize the moral implications and focus on the technical work. It's a story about how monuments to power outlast the people who build them, how the powerful get saved while the rest of us maintain the machinery of our own exclusion. The Greenbrier bunker is still there, buried under a mountain in West Virginia, empty, useless. A testament to Cold War paranoia and the fantasy that you can prepare for the end of the world by building a bigger basement. And somewhere in White Sulphur Springs, former Forsyth Associates employees live out their retirement, still carrying the secret they kept for decades, still wondering if any of it mattered. The answer, probably, is that it mattered tremendously, just not in the way they were told it would. It mattered because it revealed who we decided deserved to survive. It mattered because it showed what ordinary people will do when told their work serves national security. It mattered because it proved that we never seriously confronted the moral implications of nuclear weapons. We just built bunkers for politicians and called it a plan. And that's the darkest part of all.